Good morning. This is being recorded on Memorial Day weekend, and the topic is COVID. Now, before you click me off and say, I'm really sick and tired of thinking about COVID, I'm finally vaccinated, the situation seems to be improving, let me throw some water onto this idea. Yes, we are in a good place right now, especially in Santa Cruz. But history tells us that plagues keep coming back. And unless, but not the same plague, but historically plagues reoccur. And it's suggested by most experts that there'll be at least one more in this century, maybe more. So the time has come really to not end, but start evaluating what has worked and what hasn't worked. And so let's start at the most local level. The question arises, to what extent have governments and local governments worked? In the United States and in some other federal governments, one of the things one quickly notices was that when things like this have happened, federal governments have a hard time. How do we know this? Well, national policies were announced by the United States, let's say, and by Germany, both federal systems. And in both cases, the states didn't necessarily follow what the national governments had to say, because in the Constitution, they have certain rights and prerogatives. You may recall in the United States that all kinds of governors said, well, you know, we're not going to lock down, and we're certainly not going to tell people to wear masks and so on. Similar thing happened in Germany, where some of the state authorities said, well, we don't have to listen to the federal government. In Germany, that issue was resolved, and eventually the states agreed to let the federal government determine what was what and what they needed to do, but it still hasn't happened in the United States. So one of the problems is federal governments who don't have full authority in cases of emergency like this, and how to rethink in the health area what needs to be put into place that the next time around, or even now when everything isn't as yet hunky-dory, things can be handled. Then on the other extreme, how about authoritarian governments? Have they all fared much better? Because presumptively, either non-federal democratic governments and certainly authoritarian governments ought to be able to determine what the policy should be and to tell all its citizens what to do. That pattern is also very uneven. I mean, China, for example, has done a pretty good job of battening down the hatches once the virus broke out in Wuhan. And it has an ability to control exactly what every town and every village has to do or may not do. So in that sense, that's an illustration of a successful authoritarian government handling an issue such as this. But there are other authoritarian governments or near authoritarian governments. Think Brazil, think some East European countries, think, well, I can stop right there, which have done no better job, because when the structure at the center of a state is either ill-informed, or as in the case of Brazil, the head of states, a Trump-like figure, sticks his head into the sand, then things go out of control, right? And he has no capacity, or those governments have no capacity to control it. So what is the lesson in all of this? The lesson is not necessarily that the form of government is the determining variable, but whether, first of all, citizens are willing to follow what the government tells them to do, if it's a non-federal government, and if it's a federal government, if it's an authoritarian government, non-democratic government, whether that particular government has the capacity, be it military or whatever, to order its populations into certain behavior patterns. This is also quite complicated because one can point to some countries, for example, New Zealand, Australia, which have democratic governments where people have pretty much followed what the government told them to do and not to do, and with very good effects, that is to say, without widespread viral infection. On the other hand, you have some authoritarian governments, for example, Hungary, which through the authority and the fear and its capabilities told the citizens what to do and battened down the hatches there. Most governments in the world, however, were pretty mixed bag, a pretty mixed bag of some government effectiveness, some non-effectiveness. And I suppose the lesson here is that as we come out of the morass in especially industrial and capable countries, each type of society and government needs to re-examine what worked and what didn't work. And the adjustments might not just be necessary adjustments in terms of policy, but might be necessary adjustments of how the health system in a country is capable of working in cases of emergency. There is much work to be done in this area, and it's an extremely serious issue. Another aspect of this has to do with the global and the international level of all of this. And that has to do with, did the international institution function well or malfunction? The World Health Organization, which presumably should have been the sort of core of acting, both in terms of telling governments what policies they should produce, but also should have been the core of trying to do something about the capacity of responses in the medical field, also didn't function very well. And there, I think, are reasons to study this. And also, we already know some things about it. We know that they were underfunded, although when the Biden administration came to power, they immediately put $4 billion to help the World Health Organization. But the World Health Organization is underfunded by governments and overfunded by non-governmental organizations. And the governments that it then needs to rely on have a capacity to exercise some control. That's been true in the past of the United States. It's also was an increasing issue or problem, depending on how you look at it, with China, who then turned out to be a major funder of the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization often had to moderate or its policy dictates or its policy requests based on the particular strategy of the Chinese government. So both the capacity, the size of the World Health Organization, as well as how it's structured and how it's funded, badly needs reform and revisiting in the post-COVID era, whenever that comes about. Now, a sidearm of all of this has been the kovacs, which was set up specifically to help poor countries cope with getting the vaccines. It too operates on a very small basis. It too has been in the Biden administration funded, which it wasn't under the Trump administration. And so it's a situation where you get the two institutions, the auxiliary institution, operating in a time warp for a period where things were more manageable, but on a global scale need to be restructured and refunded, and the policies need to be revisited so that the next time around something more effective can happen. But that is also an issue that I don't want to bore you with, that has to do with other international agencies. International agencies, for example, like the World Trade Organization, which has been invoked recently in terms of patents for vaccines and so forth. To what extent can they play a role in managing the production of both the equipment and the vaccinations that are needed to service a pandemic of this particular kind? So the global international structure has been only modestly effective. And certainly that needs to be re-examined, restructured, and refunded. At a more regional level, things have also been very uneven. For example, the European Union did a very bad job in Europe at the beginning. It was meant to organize vaccine production and distribution, and it failed to do so effectively. Belatedly now, in having been much criticized and having really blown it, so to speak, at the beginning, there are now moves in the European Union which are meant to strengthen the European Union, not just with respect to a potential plague or disease, but other areas as well. So they have learned, or at least it looks as if they've learned a lesson very quickly, that they have been less than effective in some ways and need to be more effective. And I could name other organizations. For example, on the African continent, there is now there are African-wide organizations, both for trade and other things. And the question arises, will they be helpful as the whole vaccination question for the poorest and least vaccinated part of the world arises? So there's much to be done in terms of looking at both global and regional institutions and how they can be reformed. Then there's an entirely separate issue which has to do with the management of the disease itself at the level of vaccination and healthcare. We know, for example, that our CDC, which was meant to be, a class act organization, the best in the world, rather malfunctioned for two reasons. One, because the Trump administration tried to manage the institution and didn't allow the scientists and the specialists to come to a fore. That has also happened in other countries. And second of all, that the CDC their mentality was, in a sense, to study the matter rather than having the political and policy leverage to immediately at the beginning inform the government of what it needed to do to slow the spread down before there were even answers what to do about the spread, but to slow down the spread, and therefore its ability to itself think through at the beginning that the most important act was a quick act of telling folks, listen, you've got to do the following before we can figure things out. They decided, well, they needed to figure things out and then they would say things. And that also happened in other national health organizations. The other sort of negative aspect of this is, of course, that many hospitals were both in the advanced, certainly in the poor countries, but also in the advanced industrial countries, weren't really prepared for something on this scale. So the health systems in the United States and other countries need to be examined and upgraded so that when emergencies arise, there is enough oxygen, there are enough beds, there are enough, emergency and quick action of expanding hospital capacity and so forth. In the United States, actually, quite a few things have been learned here, but probably not enough. And that's also true in other industrial countries. So that there is a whole inventory of things that need to be looked at quickly and firmly at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level with respect to a health emergency of the kind that we haven't finished with it yet, have been through so far and will continue to be so far. Then there is a whole other side issue, and that has to do with the poorer countries who have absolutely zip capacity for some countries. so that even if, for example, the vaccinations were available, let's say, to most African countries, which, by the way, they have not been, and I'll talk about that in a minute, there is not the capacity to get the vaccinations to their destinations and to have the refrigeration necessary to get those vaccinations out there, and the personnel to give the vaccination. And so the whole infrastructure of the absence of a healthcare system is a major barrier to nipping these the spread of these diseases in the bud before they become national and continental catastrophes. Look at India for a minute, that you've probably listened to and read about a lot. I mean, here's a country that is far ahead in terms of technology, healthcare, and so forth of, let's say, the African continent, or look at Latin America, and they have done extremely poorly, are in a monumental mess right now. So that is an issue. Then we get to the whole development of and the distribution of the virus. I'm sorry, the inoculations to address the virus, the vaccinations. And a couple of positive and negative things can be said about it. One is the incredible lightning speed in which the vaccinations were developed, which is really stunning. If you look at it I'm sure if we looked at 50 years from now. And that says something of interest in terms of two things. One, the globalization of and networking of research physicians and laboratories, because after all, the development of these vaccines was an international effort, right? The Moderna and Pfizer's and so forth, the scientists involved weren't all in the United States. They were in Germany, they were in other countries. Lots of people shared information, and it was just an incredible medical breakthrough to do all so quickly. On the other hand, of course, the companies that produce it, the farmers that produce it, are private companies. And of course, how did these private companies funding? Well, for example, from the US government, us, the taxpayers, right? And how did they produce these vaccines? Through funding. And how, who is paying for the vaccines? Well, governments, taxpayers, right? And who is profiting from all of this? Well, the vaccinated people who don't get ill and don't die, but also the companies, right? Private enterprise stepped in. And for those who believe in the creativity of private enterprise, especially globalized private enterprise that shares information, this is a good thing. On the other hand, we now get to the second act. And the second act is, how do you get the vaccinations to countries, continents that still lack the vaccines? And here, I'm sure you've read about the fact that, should those farmers lose the patents, or temporarily should the patents be held by the companies, but suspended for the purpose of generics to produce more of the vaccine? This is a very serious question right now. You've no doubt read about it. It's a question that the World Trade Organization is considering. And, logic would tell you that generics should be quickly produced all over the world so that those parts of the world can be vaccinated before more variants of the viruses escape and revisit the countries that have more or less been managing their infection rates. And also, of course, to deter the massive deaths and suffering in those countries where people are unvaccinated. The patents are one issue, but they're not the only issue, because even if you would say, let us say, the patents come off and, Africa can produce generic vaccines for their own population, the capacity, that is to say, the equipment, the scientists, the labs, the infrastructure, the ingredients, and all of those things are not there in most instances. Now, there are a few African countries, for example, Senegal, which for historical reasons has a reasonable medical research infrastructure, but that's not true in many countries. So it's not as simple to say, okay, well, they take off the patents, you have generics, and you go down to the whatever, West Side Pharmacy or CVS, and they can then give you the generics. No, 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 even producing generics is not just a question of having overcome the patents. It's also a question of quickly generating the ingredients and the technology to produce those. So the problem is much bigger than just the patent issue. And one can see that for very many poor countries, even having the vaccines is not the end of it. Because, for example, the question of distribution, many of the vaccines from kovacs, right, the agency that is funded to make sure that poor countries have access to vaccines, and they've sent 40,000 here and 500,000 there to various countries. Many of those vaccines are sitting there, and they're becoming obsolete. They're dated. They can't be used anymore. Why? Because the capacity to distribute them didn't exist. The capacity to continue to keep them under refrigeration didn't exist. So much of the idea of COVAX was a very good idea. Let an agency siphon off some vaccinations that can go to poor countries. And you kind of resolve you don't resolve the problem for those countries, but at least you allow those countries to start vaccinating their populations. And that has badly misfired for quite a few countries, especially in Africa. And I understand even in a couple of countries in Latin America, where the vaccines are sort of rotting in warehouses and haven't been deployed. Now, are there answers to those kinds of questions? Yes, there are. And let me give you a small illustration. In a few African countries, Rwanda and Malawi in particular, prior to this, to COVID, they started using drones to deliver medical matters to rural hospitals. So for example, the capital of Rwanda is through drones being able to send blood supply to a patient who needs to be operated in a distant rural hospital. And is using contemporary technology to overcome the problem of bad roads, bad transport, difficulties of refrigeration and so forth. So one can imagine that one way to rethink this is not viable right now in a mass way. So a way to rethink this is one can overcome old-fashioned transportation issues by using modern technologies, for example, drones, to overcome the, both in terms of speed and accessibility for transporting medical equipment of one kind or another, or vaccinations of one kind or another, blood supplies and so forth. So there are answers to some of these dilemmas, but they're too late in part for COVID. But COVID has generated and needs to generate thinking on everybody's part as to how do you go from here? That is to say, what have we learned and how can it be quickly applied? Then, of course, you can say, well, it's not just that, it's also, poor governance in countries where something could have been done. India is a good case in point. India is, after all, was the producer of more vaccines than anybody else to distribute everywhere. So how is it that India is now in such a difficult position? Well, the short answer is Prime Minister Modi, who blew it in terms of policies and allowed large gatherings and the transmission of the disease, and didn't take it seriously that people needed to be isolated and locked down. So that's one answer. But it's also has a very poor healthcare system in some ways. It had the top of the healthcare system in India is just fine, but it's not fine for poor people and rural people. So a country like India, which was sort of took pride in, its capacity to prove vaccines and its capacity and its best hospitals. Even Westerners sometimes have in recent years traveled to India to have all kinds of fancy surgeries because it was cheaper than having it in the United States. So to some extent, the capacity is there. And India, in fact, is turning out lots of doctors, many of whom, by the way, are working in the United States and have kept us alive. But India has capacities that a country like Nigeria or Tanzania don't have. But the overall healthcare system for its population is incredibly poor. And one of the really sad aspects of a country like India is that now when there's a shortage of vaccinations, there is both huge bribery going on. That is to say, rich people are able to bribe themselves into getting vaccinated. And there's also huge criminal activity. You might have seen on the news that canisters with oxygen are being sold on the black market in India, and they're totally, canisters for some other purposes and are not at all useful for providing oxygen for patients. So there's a black market going on, there's corruption going on in almost all countries. And in most so-called poor countries, the corruption, among other things, means that elites are getting the benefits and the rest of the population is very sick and dying. So the inequities within countries needs to be addressed, and how it's to be addressed in a messy political environment like India is very different than it's addressed, let's say, in a very authoritarian government like China, where for better or for worse, the Chinese immediately recognized that it's not a question of rich or poor, it's a question of getting everybody protected from the virus spreading and using those as part of the technique. What all of this says, of course, is that there is no single fix, either to what kind of government, what kind of health infrastructure, what kind of warning systems, what kind of regional institutions, what kind of global institutions, what kind of policies, what kind of warning systems are needed, and what one can learn from not only what's happened so far, but the ongoing nature of this particular plague that we're living in, and that has by no means been conquered. Now, who is going to lead all of this? Well, in some senses, of course, science and scientists will lead it. In some senses, head of states can lead it. In some senses, the international institutions, be they permanent ones like the European Union or groups, G7 and groups that meet where leaders can sort out, some kind of organized policies on the part of some countries. But generally speaking, there also are lead countries which are lead in the sense of not only funding, but ideological lead countries. And of course, one of the things that has happened to the United States is that we lost influence and prestige, especially during the Trump era. And the Biden presidency is trying to restore some prestige. and some leadership. And as various commentators have pointed out, we, the United States, have a golden opportunity to really take leadership. That doesn't mean doing all the funding, although we're very rich and can contribute to it. Take some intellectual and organizational and political and ethical leadership of not only how to address the ongoing situation we're in, but laying the groundwork for building capacity in countries in the third world or the poor world, and building capacities at the regional and global level. In other words, the restoration of our influence as the United States in the world could be vastly enhanced if we help the world and helped a way of lessons learned from this particular endeavor, which has badly failed in many ways, into building not only next steps in the mess we're still in, but also figuring out what sort of things we can put in place or ask others to put in place to make the next time around less deadly on a global scale. So folks, I've just thrown out lots of bits and pieces in a less than coherent way, primarily because I want to alert us to the fact that lots of international political issues, lots of national political issues need to be addressed, partly learning from this particular horrendous experience, which we're not finished with yet, and partly just to think ahead. And even though we're very bored with the topic, we should keep thinking about it and trying to imagine innovative things of using this horrible plague in a way that becomes constructive and helpful in national as well as world affairs. Thank you very much. See you next time.